What's up, my wizards? It's Dev from Mtg down here. Should be text on your screen right around here somewhere. We like magic, and would you look at the time? It is only like a week now until Guilds of Ravnica prerelease, so we should probably get serious. Get into the lab, devote some time to smashing some cards together like this, see what all the best interactions are, what the best strategies for this limited environment. But here's the thing, though. Dog. Get a little closer. I've actually already done all that work for you. Already done all of it for you. So if you just kind of chill right here, plunk down with me and Ziggs on the couch right here, and hang out for the next God knows how many minutes. These tend to be really long videos, but I'm not going to apologize for it because we're going to go super deep into Guilds of Ravnica Sealed, tell you everything you need to know about how to brutalize your pre-release. Well, the first thing you need to know, before anything else that I tell you, is that this pre-release may be slightly different from other pre-releases you've attended in the recent past, especially if you're a newer player. But if you've ever attended a pre-release on the plane of Ravnica, you probably know what to expect. Instead of the usual 6 booster packs from a given set that you normally get at a pre-release, and a random foil stamped rare or mythic from the set, this time you'll be given 5 booster packs from Guilds of Ravnica, and then a random what's called a seeded or guild booster pack from the guild of your choosing that's only comprised of cards from that guild. And you'll still get your foil stamped rare or mythic, but this time it's going to be from the guild of your choosing too. So remember those things. That kind of begs the question then, what are the best guilds? Now, I gotta tell you, that's an entirely subjective question. Really depends on your playstyle and how you want to play a game of Magic, period. But I am here to kind of help you make an educated guess. So the bulk of this video here, the rest of our time together, is mostly going to be spent going through all the different guilds, telling you what they do, how they plan on playing out a game, their strengths, weaknesses, and what you pair them with for the most potent combinations. And considering, I want to give you as much content as possible, we're also going to go through each singular color and give you all the best cards in each color individually as well. So there's a lot of content here. I want to go ahead and get to it. Let's talk about some guilds. But let's start with the Boros Guild, the guild for people who want to get their rounds over with as quickly as possible so they can go outside and smoke or whatever they do out there. But anyway, there are some key strengths to picking the Boros Guild this time around, namely aggression, and more aggression. We just want to put the game away as early as possible with fast dudes. And as a tertiary benefit to picking this guild, we do get a decent removal suite, but it's mostly about dudes, as evidenced by the guild mechanic this time around, which is Mentor. Now, the idea here is that this allows you to make your smaller creatures a little bit bigger and win early combat interactions, thus winning the game in the long run. Now, there are some key pieces in Boros that may make you want to think about picking this guild. Among them are Boros Challenger, which you already see on your screen to help showcase the mentor mechanic, but this is a key uncommon for the strategy overall, because not only does it have mentor on it, but it's also overstated for its mana cost in the first place, and it's going to mentor an awful lot of 1/1 guys and tokens and such. So Boros Challenger is a very important uncommon for Boros this time around. But you've also got cards like Sky Knight Legionnaire that help out with your aggressive plan. This is a hard-to-block flyer with haste, so as soon as you play it on turn 3, it can start coming down and having real relevance. And of course, if you've got a creature with Mentor that's 3 power or more, it can start making your Legionnaire even bigger. Legionnaire has been good in other sealed environments, and I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. This has always been a key creature for this strategy. But I also want you to keep your eyes peeled for Swathcutter Giant, because it can't all be about small fries. Sometimes you got to have a burger. And this is a great way to bridge the gap and keep up with the fatter threats that other guilds are going to have access to. Now, in terms of what weaknesses Boros carries, let me put it to you this way. I'll give you an analogy. Sports cars aren't really known for getting good fuel economy. They might be fast, but they're not very good on gas. And without any real card advantage to speak of in this deck, plus given the fact that we want to double spell in the early turns if we possibly can, burst onto the board, with board presence, yes, but that'll cost us cards, and we run out of cards statistically much faster than the other guilds do, and we'll be just naked while they still have important cards in their hand, and that can be a problem if they can turn the corner on us in the late game. There's also the fact that, we've got a lot of really small guys. We do have, like, at least one big body threat to help keep up the pace in the later game, but most guilds, especially guilds in green, are going to have these huge fat threats that well outclass all of our guys in the late game, and that's a very real concern for the guild too. Now, before we finish up each guild in this video, I want to talk for just a second about what guilds they might pair with well, because there are a lot of guild gates in this environment that are at the common level that will help you play more than just 2 basic colors. Plus, there are a bunch of lockets for each guild that are really easy to pick up, that'll not only help you ramp, fix the colors in your guilds, but also help you splash other colors if you need to, and you might happen across a shock land or two if you're lucky, so it shouldn't be too hard to play 3 guilds, or 2 guilds, 3 different colors in this environment. So as far as what does Boros pair well with, I'd first say they pair well with Selesnya. Selesnya will help them increase their board state, and they can use Selesnya's mechanics to break into the late game. Boros wants to play a bunch of creatures already, so they work very well with Convoke, the Selesnya guild mechanic, which wants you to have a bunch of creatures on the board anyway. Boros does that relatively well, so the 2 guilds work well together, not to mention the fact that Selesnya can create a bunch of 1/1 tokens, which the Mentor mechanic works well with too. Boros can also pair with Izzet, although I don't think the pairing will be as common as Selesnya. But pairing with blue does really help the card draw problem, Getting a little bit of card advantage in the later game from blue helps you refuel your expensive sports car, so that's always good. And blue has a bunch of flying finishers that it can play on top of white's already flying finishers and really help put the game away. But let's move on and look at the Damir guild for a moment. This is the guild for players who don't care if every round goes to time as long as they get to feel like they're in control for just like an hour. That's all they want. Now, there are plenty of strengths to this guild, namely the fact that they're sneaky, controlling, they see lots of cards, and they get access to a good removal suite out of black. Plus, there is tons and tons of support for Damir's mechanic this time around, Surveil, which allows you to, again, see tons of cards and dump them into your graveyard for various purposes. And sometimes just the mere act of surveilling can be really good on your other Damir cards, like Damir's Spybug, which I do think you want to look out for. This starts off relatively small, but if you can just surveil twice, you've got a 3/3 flying menace that you only paid 2 mana for, and that's a great investment. I feel like this is going to win a lot of games of Sealed for people in Damir. Notion Rain is basically a divination type card that helps make sure you hit your 4th or 5th land drops, helps make sure you draw into more gas if you draw it in the late game. There's lots of reasons to play an effect like this in Limited. But Damir also gets some action in cards that don't even have the Surveil mechanic on them, like Artful Takedown. This looks like a decent piece of removal, and you'll play removal every time anyway, but this can also wreck your opponent's combat step, destroy their intentions of having a decent, productive 4th or 5th or 6th turn combat step, and take out one of their guys. Artful Takedown is a very good card in this Limited environment. But of course, there are some weaknesses to the Damir guild. You ever played Mario Kart? I'm sure you have. You ever picked Bowser or Donkey Kong on Mario Kart? They start really, really slow, and they've got a very, very high top end, And if they're ever interrupted by obstacles or weapons or anything like that, it takes them another long time to accelerate to the point they're going top speed again. That is kind of a good analogy for Damir in a lot of ways. We are very, very slow to start, and if we're disrupted in the wrong ways, then it can take us a little bit longer even to start up after that. So we are, again, a slow deck for all intents and purposes, and we sometimes die to fast decks before we can turn the corner. But if we can hold on and turn the corner via a well-timed removal spell, a mass removal spell, or a huge body hitting the battlefield, then that's exactly where we want to be in Damir. It takes a few turns to get there, but if you can withstand the onslaught of a deck like Boros for the first 4 turns of the game, your chances of winning go dramatically up. But you got to get there in the first place. Now, as far as the possible pairings here, I think Golgari is easily one of the better ones, and that's obvious. Not only does Golgari give us a lot better late-game threats, but we also have obvious synergy with the Undergrowth mechanic in Golgari. We'll talk more about the mechanic later, but it basically cares about creatures in your graveyard, and Surveil is a mechanic that allows you to dump cards into your graveyard. So, obviously, we've got tons and tons of synergy built in with the Golgari guild. But Damir also pairs up with the Izzet guild really well for max spell slinging. Both of these guilds care a lot about spells, have decent removal suites, and draw a lot of cards. Plus, there's great synergy with the Jumpstart mechanic out of Izzet. Again, we dump cards into graveyards, and Jumpstart allows us to play a card even if that card is in our graveyard. So there's obvious synergy there as well. But let's look at the Selesnya guild for a minute here. This is for people who bought a bunch of those glass beads from the dollar store and have nothing better to do with them. They sometimes make good tokens, but in any case, there are a lot of strengths to this guild this time around. We are all about filling the battlefield, and we use board presence and board pressure as a form of onboard card advantage in some ways. That's either through activated abilities like those on Ledev Champion, a very important uncommon for this guild that not only allows you to go big when you need to by tapping all your creatures to make it huge. But it also gives you a mana sink that allows you to create creatures, which Selesnya wants. They want to be able to use Convoke, their guild mechanic this time around, and we've seen Convoke before. It's great on a board full of tokens, and that's what Selesnya does best. A fair amount of support for Convoke can be found in this set, and a lot of it is on creatures like World Soul Colossus. This is another important uncommon for this guild that you want to pick up if you're in the guild in the first place. World Soul can not only just suck up all of your mana and come in as a big creature, but obviously, if you got a battlefield full of tokens, this is another way to go big and just put a 10/10 on the field all of a sudden. Another good card to look out for in Selesnya that's a little bit unassuming is Sumala Woodshaper. A lot like Boros, Selesnya has no real card advantage to speak of. Once they're out of cards, they're in a little bit of trouble if they don't have any activated abilities or other onboard tricks that they can use to generate some form of advantage. Again, there's no real ways to draw cards, but Sumala Woodshaper gives us a way to do just that while putting a body on the battlefield. This is a more important card than it might look like. Now, as far as the weaknesses of Selesnya Guild, I've already discussed one of them. Just like Boros, it's kind of tough to come across card advantage in this guild. And there's also the fact that the majority of our creatures are above rate, which sounds like a good thing, but it's actually bad. We want our creatures to be below the given rate for a creature, but a lot of our creatures cost more than they should, but that's because they have Convoke built into them, which usually increases their casting cost overall. That means to get some of our most important cards onto the battlefield, we're going to have to let our defenses down for a turn and tap a few of our creatures, which sometimes is not ideal. Now, as far as pairings, Selesnya goes pretty well with Golgari. We get a little bit more depth at the removal slot, but we mostly want it for the ability to use the graveyard as an additional resource. This allows us to use the graveyard as kind of a form of card advantage in the late game, and we pair well with the undergrowth mechanic because we want to play a bunch of small creatures anyway, and that'll often fill the graveyard because we chump block with them or we lose them in combat for other reasons, So we fill the graveyard relatively easily, and that can work very well with undergrowth. Selesnya also pairs with Boros for, again, a little bit more removal depth for the red, but we also get a lot more aggression to help us put a game away a little bit faster if we want to do that. And Selesnya also has pretty decent synergy with Mentor. Already mentioned that, but I want to bring it up again here, because again, Selesnya makes a bunch of 1/1, sometimes 1/1 lifelink guys, and mentoring those can actually be really important. But let's check out the Is It Guild, my personal favorite guild from this set. This is for smart people who are good at math or something, at least that's how it's marketed, but in any case, we have a few strengths in this guild, mostly that we're tricky, and we have a lot of strong non-creature spells. If you want to draw cards and zap stuff, Is It is the guild for you, and we do that with a few important cards in this guild set. We've got Hypothesizzle, Snoop Dogg's favorite card from the set. Really want to look out for this. It costs an awful lot of mana, but it's a couple of drawn cards, and it's a dead creature, and both of those things are very good and sealed. You also want to check out Beacon Bolt, which is a relatively narrow card, but any removal spell you can use twice in the limited environment is bound to be a very, very good spell. So even if Beacon Bolt isn't technically, quote, turned on until turn 5 or 6, it's still a very effective removal spell. But you also want to be on the lookout for a Goblin Electromancer or two if you can get your hands on them in this guild. We mostly want to play spells. That's its big game plan, and this helps us do that more efficiently, so it's a key card. Now, as far as weaknesses for the Is It Guild go, there are a few of them, I gotta say, even though, again, this is my personal favorite guild from our choice of 5 guilds this time around. They kind of got, in some ways, the short end of the stick. Of course, because they have a strong non-creature spell base, they have a corresponding lack of power in the actual creature base for the most part. It's also sometimes a little bit too tricky for its own good, and this has been the case in just about every Ravnica sealed environment in terms of how Is It performs, There's a lot of relatively esoteric or narrow function on some of the Is It cards, switching power and toughness on a creature, that's weird, copying a spell, that's weird, we'll make it cost a bunch of mana. So sometimes, again, Is It gets a little bit too tricky for its own good, and that ends up being slightly narrow, we'll put it that way. But you do have a couple of good pairs this time around, namely the Damir Guild, which again, I just have to reiterate, is a crazy pairing with Is It. You draw a bunch more cards and you have a harder removal suite when you add the black. And as stated, Surveil and Jumpstart are peanut butter and marshmallows. I was going to say jelly, but I wanted to veer away from the cliche, but I think once you started it, you might as well finish it. They're peanut butter and jelly. Surveil and Jumpstart are ridiculous together. Just keep that in mind. And I'll also restate that it pairs at least reasonably well with Boros, although again, I don't think this will be the most popular pairing ever, but this does give us a better early game overall and more solid threats in the early game, which is really important. You know, with Boros' early threats, sometimes Izzet's cards can be a great form of reach. You know, a burn spell here or there can really help supplement the early damage you got from your Boros beaters. And the Golgari Guild. This is the guild for people who like to go outside and dig random holes when they were kids, and it does have plenty of strengths this time around. There are a fair amount of support guards for the Undergrowth mechanic, which is the premier Golgari mechanic this time around. As I've said, this just wants you to have cards in your graveyard, creature cards in your graveyard specifically, which actually isn't super hard to do in a game of Sealed, you know. You'll lose an awful lot of creatures to early and mid-game combat interactions anyway, so Undergrowth, especially once you get to the middle and later turns, is a free form of value. As far as our strengths, we do have good removal from black and nice threats from green, but the name of the game here is to again get late game value out of the graveyard in various ways. Undergrowth is a big part of that, but we also have at least one reanimatable creature that I want to talk about at some point in this video, and a couple of other ways that we can use, you know, the Golgari mechanics to help abuse our board state or our graveyard state for card advantage. Now, some ways of doing that are with Rhizome Lurcher. This is a card I'd really look out for if I picked the Golgari Guild coming up this Saturday. Now, Rhizome Lurcher in the late game is obviously a very good card. You know, this isn't really that good on turn 4 or 5, one would imagine, but on turn 7, 8, or 9, this is a huge creature a lot of the time, a 5/5, a 6/6, depending on what's in your yard. There's also Molder Hulk, which can be pretty much the same rate as a Rhizome Lurcher for the same stats, you know. For 4 mana sometimes, you'll get something as big as this 6/6 that also gives you a land back from the graveyard, which can sometimes be important, but again, in the very late turns, once you've turned the corner, it's turn 6, turn 7, turn 8. Molder Hulk will often cost you 4 or 5 mana, and that's exactly where you want to be. Again, the Golgari Guild wants to play huge threats very late on in the game, and it usually wants to use the Undergrowth mechanic to do it. But we've got to get creatures in the graveyard in the first place, and there are plenty of ways to do it. But one of the better green-black cards that can do it is Undercity Uprising, because this is something that can not only put a creature in your graveyard if you need to do that with it, but it can also help you trade up, trade a very small creature you'd rather have in your graveyard anyway, for the best threat on their side of the battlefield, and it's just straight up removal period, which you'll always take in Sealed. Now, if there are some weaknesses to Golgari, it's really that we're often top-heavy with a degree of clunk, you know? Sometimes Undergrowth won't work the way you want it to every time. Abilities like Jumpstart, for instance. All they want you to do is cast the spell or dump it in your graveyard. It's not that hard. Convoke just wants you to have creatures out. Mentor just wants you to have creatures that are smaller than other creatures. Surveil just works on its own, but the Golgari's mechanic is the hardest one to actually get value out of, and I can't understate that. So you want to point that out. Sometimes it's going to be a little bit harder to get the value out of Undergrowth than you really want it to be, and that'll make you a little top-heavy, and again, slightly clunky in some games. So do remember that. Although we're amazing in the late game once we do fill our graveyard, sometimes it can be a little tough to get there. Now, as far as pairings with Golgari, we got a couple of good ones. We can team up with Selesnya to form an Abzan deck. It's actually pretty good. Between green-white and green-black, we end up having some of the best stall breaking in the entire Sealed environment. And that's a nice thing to be able to do. Plus, both, you know, white and black have nice removal options, so we add depth at that slot as well. There's also a very, and I mean very, very slight sacrificing creatures theme in black. There's a black uncommon that I'm thinking of in particular that might be really important for making aristocrats builds in Abzan. Selesnya helps you do that by fueling sacrifice strategies with a bunch of small creatures or tokens. And there's also synergy between Convoke and Undergrowth, mostly because they're both really creature-centric abilities, you know. If your creatures are on the battlefield, they can help you convoke things. If your creatures are in the graveyard, then they can help you get more value out of Undergrowth. So the abilities work pretty well together. And again, alluded to this earlier, but I'll reiterate once more that Golgari pairs really well with the Damir Guild, because the Damir Guild has a mechanic that just lets it dump cards into the graveyard, which is exactly where we want our creatures to be anyway, due to the Undergrowth mechanic. So again, Damir and Golgari go very, very well together. Now, there are other pairings that you could do as far as 3-color combinations that I want to hit real quick before I get into individual colors, but I don't think you'll use them too often. Like Jund, green, black, and red is theoretically possible because, you know, black and green both have Undergrowth, which focuses on the graveyard. Black has Surveil, that allows you to dump cards in the graveyard. Red has Jumpstart to an extent, that allows you to play cards out of your graveyard. So I could see all of these abilities working fairly well together, but again, I think all of the different 2 and 3 color combinations I've already discussed so far are probably better than going Jund. It all depends on your sealed pool. To that extent, there's also Mardu, black, red, and white, which you might want to consider. The Boros game plan of just red and white works pretty well, but if you splash black and go Mardu, you can get Undergrowth stuff. Again, Boros, just like Selesnya, plays a bunch of creatures in the early game, and a lot of them will end up in the graveyard eventually in the first few turns, you know? So you could take advantage of that by splashing black and playing cards like Necrotic Wound to get an advantage out of the Undergrowth. It's possible. And also, before I get into the individual colors, I want to briefly discuss the cycle of guild mages and the 4-mana cycle of cards in each guild. First of all, the guild mages, if you get these, play them. They're playable. All of them have very good activated abilities that might not look good at first, you know, analysis, but are just generally great in most ways. They may allow you to draw cards or advance your board presence or zap a creature or whatever. All of these are good, and if you're in a given guild, you want to play your guild mage. No questions asked. Same thing with the 4-mana cycle. If you're only playing 2 cards or 2 colors in a given guild, you know, if you decided Boros and you didn't splash a color, then the Boros 4-color guy or 2-color guy is very, very good. I meant to say 4-mana guy, but in any case, you get my drift here. Pretty much no matter which guild you're in, your 4-mana guy that costs, you know, 2 of each color is going to be very good. But in Damir guild, be on the lookout especially for Nightveil Predator, which looks like a very, very dangerous creature. But let's finish it off by going through each individual color and talking about the best commons and uncommons in the set. But you may have noticed I did when I talked about all the different guilds. I haven't brought up any rares or anything, or mythics, because you're very unlikely to see a specific rare or mythic in the sealed environment. So I mostly like to keep it to commons and uncommons and cards that you're more likely to see by a great deal. So with that in mind, let's start going through the individual colors with white. Now, there are plenty of uncommons in white to look out for. Sunhome Stalwart being the first one I want to talk about. There are plenty, I mean plenty, of, you know, 1-mana, 1/1s in the set, or otherwise 1-power creatures in this set. And the turn 2 Sunhome Stalwart can really make it worth your while to play 1-drops in sealed. But there's also Rock Charger. We've seen a creature like this in most limited environments recently. There's actually not one in blue this time, but white gets one. And I know that 1/3 doesn't look like a great rate, but it does fly. It gives another creature an evasive ability, and it's meant to be small. They designed it this way on purpose so that it will work well with the Mentor ability. Keep that in mind. Once it gets to a 2/4, you've actually, you know, paid a great rate for your flyer. But there's also Inspiring Unicorn, which really doesn't look like much, but when it attacks, it gets to the correct rate. You know, a 4-mana 3/3, a hill giant, as we call them in sealed. It's not the best rate, but it's at least the going rate for a playable creature in sealed. So when it attacks, you get your hill giant and you anthem the rest of your team, which is going to be especially important on a token-filled battlefield. You know, if you're in Selesnya, Inspiring Unicorn is going to be one of the only anthem effects that you really have access to, and that's going to be really important. There's also Conclave Tribunal, which is probably all things considered the best white uncommon in the entire set. This is straight up removal against literally anything, and it can be as low as free some of the time. So this again is probably the standout white uncommon, and maybe even the best Convoke card in the entire set. Pick it up if you see any. Now, in terms of white commons, ironically, I mostly have a bunch of removal to show you. I figured there'd be a bunch of playable white common creatures, and there are. White has nothing but solid playable creatures in the common and uncommon slot. There's really not a whole lot that you don't want to play, so keep that in mind. A lot of solid playable creatures here, but I'm going to focus on the removal at the common slot. There's Color the Culprit, Luminous Bonds, and Righteous Blow. These are all decent removal pieces. Even, yes, Righteous Blow, which costs a very, very low amount of mana and can blow away smaller creatures in this environment. Even if you're just killing a token, it's going to be worth a mana. You always play removal. Righteous Blow is no exception. Color the Culprit is awesome, obviously, because it kills bigger stuff, and Luminous Bonds kills just about anything. I'll pay an extra mana for a pacifism these days. It's still a very, very good removal spell. Again, this might be the best common in white just because it takes out just about anything, no matter what the size. but there are bodies at the common slot I do want to talk about in white. The first of which is Sworn Companions, which isn't really a body, but it does give you 2 lifelink bodies, which will help you extend the game against aggressive decks, get to the mid-game where you'd really rather be. All things considered, so that's important. And it also helps with your Convoke plan. That's really important. It really helps, against the Damir decks and the other slower decks to help you explode on the board, get, some sort of board advantage on them, a tempo advantage, give them multiple threats that they have to deal with on more than just a one-for-one basis. I think that in some ways, tokens decks are going to be the death knell of Damir decks in this limited environment, because it's going to be very, very tough for Damir decks to deal with a board full of tokens because they mostly have one-for-one removal. We can take advantage of that weakness by just exploding onto the board with a bunch of guys, and this is one of the cards that's going to be key to that strategy. But let's move on to blue and look at the uncommons first. Now, the first thing I want you to look out for is City Watch Sphinx. This is an important card for a few reasons. First of all, it's a big, giant flyer. You always play those in sealed, pretty much no matter what, so all I really have to do is point out the fact that this card exists, and you should know it's good. But it's also good against Nightveil Predator, by the way. Brought this card up earlier. Again, this looks like a very dangerous card in this sealed environment, the limited environment overall. But big flyers that, kill it in combat are going to be maybe the best way to deal with it. So you might want to look out for City Watch Sphinx for that reason, if no other. There's also Murmuring Mystic. If you're in an Izzet deck that's using a bunch of spells anyway, or even a Damir deck that's playing a bunch of spells anyway, then Murmuring Mystic may actually be a pseudo-finisher for you. If this can just get 2 or 3 birds out for you, that can clean off the game really, really quickly, quicker than you might expect, because a few power hitting in the air every turn can close the game out fast. But of course, blue's mostly about the spells, and that's no different this time. I like Selective Snare a little bit because this is usually just going to return 1 creature to their hand, but that's okay for 2 mana, even at sorcery speed. Rex their tempo, that might be important, but anytime you can nab 2 soldiers or 2 zombies or 2 shamans or whatever with a Selective Snare, then it's a great spell at just 3 mana. Wrecking your opponent's tempo like that is a really desirable thing to do, and do not forget, that this is just straight up removal against tokens, which is going to be a very important tool for Damir and Izzet to have against these Selesnya builds. But also, watch out for Chemister's Insight. You're going to want this card. This is a great jumpstart card, and maybe the best jumpstart card at the common or uncommon level. This is great with Surveil, obviously. Dump it in your graveyard and just cast it out of your graveyard. That's always fine, so you want that. And it's good in, Sultai decks, green, black, and blue, because you're going to be dumping a bunch of cards in your graveyard for Undergrowth anyway, so you don't mind if a Chemister's Insight finds its way into the graveyard either. But there's also a bevy of blue commons to look at. Usually, I don't rate blue very highly on the sealed scale, but it's looking fairly strong this time around. At common, we've got Watcher in the Mist, another thing that beats Nightveil Predator in combat. Keep that in mind. But it's also, again, decently fat threat, well statted, flies through the air and hits with evasion. That's good. And we get a Surveil trigger on it too, so all of that is really good. But as far as other blue commons to look at, I actually do like Vidalcan Mesmerist a little bit. This card will win an awful lot of early game combat interactions, and is a pretty good way to, effectively counter the mentor mechanics. So I like a good bit about this. It's well statted. It's more than just a filler creature. In terms of 2 mana, 2 power creatures, you're almost always going to play those in limited as filler anyway to help, make sure your curve is full and all that. But I think that this is actually one of the better 2 power 2 drops in the entire set, quietly. There's also Pass Wall Adept, which, again, quietly, looks like one of the best commons in the game for breaking open things late. If you're trying to, beat a board stall or something like that, sending through your biggest creature every turn, unblockable guaranteed, is a pretty big game, so I actually think this might be one of the best activated abilities in the entire sealed environment. Don't sleep on it. And finally, there's Radical Idea, which is like a mini Chemister's Insight, but you'll still take it. Chemister's Insight is a very fine card for what it does, and Radical Idea is a fine card for literally all of the same reasons, just cut in half. But as far as black cards go, I gotta tell you, first of all, Black gets maybe one of the best uncommons in the entire set, if not the best uncommon, with Necrotic Wound. I've already sort of touched on this, but I expect that a lot of two-color combinations, a lot of guilds, will splash black just to play Necrotic Wound. You know, a lot of sealed decks are going to have a fair amount of creatures in them anyway, 16, 18, sometimes 20 creatures on the very high end of things. So the Undergrowth mechanic doesn't necessarily look amazing on every card, but Necrotic Wound is always going to be great on turn 5, 6, 7, and any turn later on in the game than that. Necrotic Wound is just incredible, all at the low cost of 1 mana, which allows you to cast other spells or use activated abilities that you might have on the board. So Necrotic Wound, again, don't sleep on this either. It doesn't really look like much to some players, and it's not going to be very good in the first 2-3 turns of the game. But once you get into the later game, Necrotic Wound turns on, activates, so to speak, and just becomes maybe the best single removal spell in the entire sealed format. But that's not to say it's the only removal piece. Obviously, black is known for its removal sweep, no different this time around. Price of Fame is something I want you to look out for. This can obviously kill legends at a great rate, which will be important some of the time, especially against all the bomb rares and mythics in the set. You know, everyone wants to play their big, stupid mythic legend that they got out of their guild pack. Well, go ahead and cut that dream down for only 2 mana and Surveil too. It's a lot of value if you cast it on a legend. But remember, you can cast it on a non-legend for 4 mana, which isn't the best rate in the world, but it's still very, very good instant speed removal in the limited environment, and you get the Surveil no matter what. So killing a guy and setting up your next draw at the end of your opponent's turn is really, really good. But there's also Plague Crafter. This is removal on a body, effectively, so it helps me transition into the talking about bodies phase of the uncommons here. Plague Crafter, you'll play it every time you get it. You know, this is sometimes sacrifice-based removal against your opponent, sometimes it makes them discard a card, and very, very, very occasionally, it's going to make them get rid of Ralzeric or Vraska or whatever other, you know. I think that's actually it, but still, it's going to make them get rid of a Planeswalker on extremely rare occasions, but mostly we're looking to trade this, or again, a smaller creature on our side of the battlefield, like a token or something. Maybe we paired up with Selesny or something like that in Golgari, but we sacrifice a token to Plague Crafter, or even just Plague Crafter itself, and kill a creature on the other side of the board. Now, I will say that because Selesny is in the format, Plague Crafter doesn't look as good, because sometimes, again, they'll just be able to sacrifice a token, but it's still an important card with a decent-sized body for the mana cost, and it's going to get something off of your opponent's side of the battlefield, or maybe just get an important card out of their hand. All of that is good stuff. But the hits just keep on coming. There are actually a couple of uncommon black creatures that I think are sleepers in the sealed environment, the limited environment at large, that I want to talk about. The first of which is Crawl Swarm. This is one of the very, very few creatures in this environment, and I believe the only creature at this rarity that can reanimate itself in some form or fashion. I like that this also feeds your Undergrowth, for what it's worth, and that might be important, but again, we're playing out of the graveyard. Surveil's dumping cards in the graveyard a lot of the time. So something like this that can reanimate itself is actually a very desirable creature. It also has flying and a really big power, so I don't care that much about the toughness, especially given the fact that we can just feed creatures to it in our graveyard and get it back. That's going to be really, really good in the late game, and I imagine that this is going to be a very annoying card. But there's also Undercity Necrolist, you know. Another reason that Golgari might want to team up with Abzan is to employ a sort of aristocrats theme, you know. If your seal pool's just right for it, you want to go Abzan, you know, then you can just sacrifice tokens to Necrolist, and it's got this ridiculous threat of activation. This is actually capable of winning a game for you by itself, believe it or not. But black has its share of ridiculous commons too, most of which are removal, I'll admit. First of all, Dead Weight and Deadly Visit. You know, anything with dead in the name is good removal, and you want to pick that up in black. In Guilds of Ravnica, you know. Dead Weight doesn't look like much, but it's only 1 mana to kill an awful lot of creatures and make just about everything really small and manageable, so that's good. Even if you don't kill a creature with Dead Weight, it's still a fine card, although I recommend that you kill creatures if you possibly can. You want to 1-for-1 them. You don't want to 1-for-0 them, you know. So kill creatures if you can, but when you really needed to, this can be a safety valve and turn a 3/3 into a 1/1. So keep that in mind. Deadly Visit is just hard removal, and you'll play it. You'll play every single copy that you get of this, and it also helps Surveil for you. Look at that. They just tack Surveil onto so many cards, and it's so good. There's also Mephitic Vapors, another card they tack Surveil onto. But this will be really good out of the sideboard. Do keep in mind, anything you don't play in your main deck in the sealed environment at your pre-release is effectively in your sideboard sideboard, so you can slot it in games 2, game 3 if you need it. So if you come across tokens builds in Selesnya, Mephitic Vapors is a great tool to cut down most of their tokens and set up your next draw step. But there's also Hired Poisoner. I really, really like 1 mana, 1/1 Death Touch guys. I've always liked them. They're great in sealed. They threaten to take out a huge attacker. You know, this can back down a 5/5 from attacking because they don't want to trade their, 5/6 mana creature for your 1 mana guy. It's the worst trade imaginable, and they don't want to attack into it. So sometimes this can hold a whole team back if your opponent doesn't want to give an inch as far as board presence goes. And this is also really easy to get into our graveyard for Undergrowth, which might be important too, but mostly I just want to point out that I love cheap Death Touchers in sealed. They're pretty much always good, no exceptions here. And finally, there's Moodmark Painter. I got a feeling about this card. Let's say that you have a flyer out and you play Moodmark Painter and you give your flyer +3/+0 or something like that. Well, you also give your flyer Menace, which means it's going to be really difficult to block, and it can sometimes, I can see situations where a Painter helps you get through that last 5-6 damage on a flying creature. So I don't think Painter is bad, and it might be a card you want to keep your eye out for, because as far as Undergrowth payoffs, it actually slyly, quietly looks like one of the best in some ways. But let's look at red right here, and I want to point out Goblin Banneret first, even though I usually don't care that much for 1-drops in the sealed environment, but they are really important this time around because the Mentor ability is mostly on like 2-power 2-drops and stuff, even 2-power 3-drops and whatnot. So you need, amazingly, this is one sealed environment where you actually want like 1 mana 1/1s, and Goblin Banneret is the best of the 1 mana 1/1s in the entire set as far as I'm concerned, for sealed play at least, because it's got a great mana sink on it. You want mana sinks in sealed anyway. This can get reasonably large for only a couple of mana, mentor creatures that are smaller. This is actually a really good 1-drop that can do a house worth of work for you, especially if left unchecked. But there's also Goblin Crater Maker. I like this card a lot, and I think it might actually see a fair degree of standard play as a hate bear, a toolbox, 2 mana 2/2. That's at least a bear if nothing else, but it has like a Swiss Army knife style on it. It can do a lot of different things, take out artifacts and other colorless stuff like Karn and standard, but in sealed, I like the idea of a filler creature, again a bear, 2 mana 2/2s, always playable in sealed, but it can also take out an important creature if you needed to. I also want to talk about Hellkite Whelp for a second because it's just obviously good. A 5 mana 3/3 flyer is exactly the rate that you want, and it's got a pretty decent ability tacked onto it, especially against tokens decks. This is a beast and a very good card. And finally, there's Lava Coil, if only because it's great removal. You'll never not play this card. You'll play every single copy you get if you get any copies. It's just 2 mana, almost hardline removal. Yeah, there's plenty of creatures that don't die to it, but 90% of the creatures in this environment do, and you'll never have to worry about them ever again. So, we already talked about one creature I think is important because it can reanimate itself. This can kill that forever. That might be important, but either way, again, you'll never not play Lava Coil. The card is very good. As far as commons go, I think that red makes up for sort of a lackluster showing at the uncommon slot with a fair amount of commons. There are at least like 6 commons I want to talk about here, like Direct Current, which, like I said earlier about Beacon Bolt, a removal spell you can play twice is always good. Even if it's relatively narrow, this only does 2 damage. But the fact that you can play it effectively twice just makes it unbelievably good in sealed. 1 card can kill 2 cards. Yeah, you'll have to spend 2 cards, you have to discard something to the jumpstart, but you get my point. 1 card that can kill 2 cards is a very good card indeed, so you'll play all the copies of Direct Current you get too. There's also Command the Storm, which I don't have much to say about other than it's fine removal. Again, this is at least a decent rate, and it's going to kill most creatures in the sealed environment, so you'll play it when you get it. But there's also kind of tricky stuff, I like Maximize Velocity for a few reasons. This will give decks that want to play spells a way to play more spells in a given turn for very, very cheap, so at least there's that. But this works very, very well with Boros, with the Mentor mechanic, and this also, if it's sitting in your graveyard, makes all of your creature plays live for the rest of the game. Any creature that you draw for the rest of the game threatens to attack the turn that it comes down, which is actually really good. Having one of these in your graveyard seems like a great deal of peace of mind. I like that. It's really, really cheap, works with Mentor. Max Velocity is actually a lot better than it looks. There's also Wojak Bodyguard, which is just great. Like, this is just really, really good. 3 mana, 3/3. That's a good rate. And it's got Mentor, which just makes it insane because you actually don't see a whole lot of good, well-statted, high-power creatures with Mentor at a decent rate in this limited environment. This is about as good as it gets. A 3 mana, 3-power guy with Mentor is going to mentor an awful lot of dudes, and you want this guy every time you get him if you're in the aggressive Boros deck. But there's also Rubble Belt Boar, which really does not look at all like much on its face, but this is really decent with Mentor too, and it's a great top-end for aggressive decks at the common slot. Again, Hill Giants are at least somewhat playable. That's the going rate in Sealed at the very least. But this can also give a creature with Mentor a power boost so that it can mentor something it normally wouldn't be able to mentor. And it's just good that this has some sort of effect on the battlefield the turn it comes into play, so even if they killed it, it at least did something for you. This card, again, very unassuming, but it does an awful lot for you in the aggressive deck. And finally, we've made it to green here, which again has a lot of play in this environment. I like Golgari, I like Selesnya. Between those two guilds, green has an awful lot of cool stuff. As far as the uncommons go, I like Sprouting Renewal a good bit. This is a way to play a main deck card at a relatively low rarity, just uncommon, that bust artifacts and enchantments. So if your opponent's trying to get cute with a powerful enchantment or a powerful artifact they've managed to get in their sealed pool, this is a good way of dealing with that in game one, but it's also a good way of getting an absolutely free creature sometimes, and you can't knock that. The versatility's high, and the ability, again, to get a free creature is always good. I'm not going to say that's bad. There's also District Guide, great card. Again, you might not think this is a great card when you first look at it, but the enter the battlefield trigger is very, very good in Sealed. And limited at large, period, it helps you fix your mana, helps you play, not just 2 colors, but 3 colors a lot more easily. This can go get a gate, so you're bound to have incredible fixing starting on as early as turn 5. But even if this just goes and gets your 4th land drop for you, I can't overstate how great that is in Sealed to guarantee your 4th land drop. It's a lot better than it sounds, and it puts a body on the battlefield. God is a ridiculous card. Also like Crawl Harpooner a good bit just because flying creatures are so important in Sealed. Most people's game plans in Sealed, a lot of people's at least, are going to be, stall the game until I can get through with the biggest flyer that I got in my Sealed pool. That's just how it is some of the time. And Crawl Harpooner, again, is a good main deck way of dealing with big flying creatures in a color that normally wouldn't have access to removal in the first place. But this can kill something, put a body on the battlefield. Usually when it doesn't kill something, it's putting a body on the battlefield. And a well-statted body for the cost at that, so there's just no reason not to play this card. But a lot of green's power really rests in big, giant, fat, late-game dudes, and Arboretum Elemental is probably the best of them in green this time around. Obviously, this costs a buttload of mana, but if you just have a couple of creatures to help convoke it into play, it gets down to at least a decent rate, and once it starts costing 6 mana, it's a really, really good rate. It's a huge hexproof dude they're going to have an awful lot of trouble dealing with, and it's slowly going to take over the game, if not just in the game in a couple of bites. Another green uncommon is Affectionate Indrik. This thing is amazing and might actually be, all things considered, the other best green uncommon in the set. Arboretum Elemental is great. District Guide is great. There's a ton of great green uncommons, but Affectionate Indrik is on another level. It does cost 5 mana, but 5 mana for a 4/4 is the going rate in Limited or in Sealed at least, so I'll take it, and it fights something when it enters the battlefield. This gives us a great chance to, not only kill something, but leave behind a 4/4 on the battlefield. If you can make Indrik into a 2-for-1 effectively, it's done its job, and it's actually become one of the best creatures in the whole Sealed environment. Now, the common slot in green also provides us a lot of these, giant fat creatures that are, really above rate. Again, really, really expensive. But we've got Vigor Spore Worm and Siege Worm. The Worm brothers, the Worm gang, is back. The boys are back in town. Vigor Spore Worm, brand new. Siege Worm, a reprint. But both of these very, very important to the top end of not only, obviously in the case of Vigor Spore Worm, Golgari, but in the case of Selesnya, Siege Worm. Here's the thing, actually, there's a good amount of interplay between both of those guilds. They could actually both play these cards. Obviously, Selesnya plays Siege Worm a little bit better. Golgari plays Vigor Spore Worm a little bit better. But especially if you're, mixing those guilds together, or even if you're not, even if you're just playing Selesnya, Vigor Spore goes very well in a Selesnya deck. Same with Siege Worm. If you got a couple of creatures out, Siege Worm can go pretty well in your Golgari deck as well. So these are actually very, very good late game finishers at the common level for green. I'll also bring up Prey Upon, if only for a second. Green really doesn't have much removal. It is known for not having any removal to speak of, but Prey Upon is one of the best removal pieces you'll find in green, period, in just about any set. 1 green mana for this effect is really, really low, so you'll take it just about every time. Unless you've got much, much better removal options in other colors, and a lot of them for that matter, you'll pretty much take Prey Upon every time you get it too. But finally, I think this is the last card I want to talk about today. I think we've made it, guys. We're here. Is Crawl Forager. Now, again, this does not look like much, but like I said earlier, one of the problems for a slower, clunkier deck like Golgari can be turning the corner against certain fast decks or decks that increase their board presence quickly like Selesnya. If you drop this on turn 5 and gain 3 or 4 life, that helps you really mitigate a lot of the damage they've done to you up to that point, plus put a fat threat that outclasses most of their attackers on the battlefield. So there's that. But I think we finally made it to the other side, you guys. We did it. You and me together. But in any case, I'm pretty sure I'm tapped out for this one. That's all I got to say about this pre-release. But make sure if you got any extra advice or anything down there, make sure you shoot it to those younger players that are just attending their first couple of pre-releases, or maybe even their first ever pre-release. You never know. So while you're still here, I want to remind you again, like the video, do all the YouTube stuff, subscribe, follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev, and check out my sponsors over at TCG Player. If you're gonna get a box of the set, you might as well pre-order it from them at like $10 off MSRP. Seriously. It's like $90 or $91 for a box over there on TCG Player. You're so cute, buddy. But seriously, that is way below what MSRP is going to be when the set comes out. So go ahead and pre-order your boxes if you got the skrill. First link in the description for that, and there's actually multiple links in the description, because I also want you to check out my Patreon if you have an extra $1. I know that playing Magic's super expensive, but if you have $1 a month, I'll let you not only know what decks and stuff we're doing the day before we do them, but I'll also let you vote in polls on what decks you even want to see this season in the first place. You can alter the course of YouTube history. Just click the second link down there in the description box and throw me a whole $1 a month. That's all I ask. Especially if I help you win your pre-release. That's worth $1, right? But in any case, I'm pretty sure I'm actually done for this one. So good luck, you guys. And I'll actually see you a bunch of times before the pre-release, because I got a lot to say about the set. We've got the top 10 sleepers coming up, the top 20 cards in the set. So don't think I'm done talking about this set. Content's just beginning, so subscribe and I'll catch you cats later. I'm Dev from the place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. No matter what you do, make sure you spread love and be kind.
I got the music in me, knew it simply had to be my destiny. I'm blessed to be the best within my CNHEND. Please believe not Ninja Gaiden. I'm not the guy to fight with them lightning. They come in dumb and I leave them enlightened.